introduce this contribution prepared by myself and my colleague Adam HUDEK, I would first like to explain at least briefly the specific organization of the Academies of Sciences in Czechoslovakia from the early 50s to the dissolution of Czechoslovakia at the end of 1992. The Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences was established in the autumn of 1952 and was to become the supreme academic institution following the example of the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union. That means that it combined the representative role of learned society and the function of a network of academic institutions. What is important in order to understand the concept of our joint contribution, however, is the asymmetric structure of this Academies of Sciences from the viewpoint of the regional representation, also drawing on the Soviet pattern. As early as in 1953, the Slovak National Council adopted a law establishing the Slovak Academy of Sciences, which was to function as an autonomous part of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences, while in fact its ties to the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences were in many respects quite loose. This was due to the fact that except for the Institute of Virology in Bratislava for a limited time to 1968, all the other institutions making up the network of Czechoslovak Academy institutes were located solely in Czech lands. Czechoslovak Academy members came from both parts of the country, but Czech scientists largely prevailed, and the position of the chairman of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences was always occupied by a Czech academician. Later, however, a rule was adopted that every chairman of the Slovak Academy of Sciences was always appointed as the deputy chairman of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. This asymmetric model was not limited to Accademia, but was also applied, for instance, to the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia with the Communist Party of Slovakia existing alongside it. As part of the country's federalization in 1968, there were plans to modify this model, and the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences was to become merely an umbrella organization linking the Czech Academy of Sciences and Slovak Academy of Sciences. That, however, did not happen, and the model was left in place as it was until Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. At present, there is an independent Czech Academy of Sciences that has no fellows and serves only as a network of institutions undertaking basic research. The representative role was passed to learned society, which, although closely linked with the Czech Academy of Sciences, draws more on the legacy of the Royal Bohemian Society of Sciences, dissolved in 1952. In contrast, the Slovak Academy of Sciences has maintained its fellows as well, and as its network of institutes. From the 1950s, research into the history of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences and its predecessor, especially the Royal Bohemian Society of Sciences, which had been active since the late of 18th century, and the Czech Academy of Sciences and Art, established in 1890, was carried out especially in the archives of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences, which, however, was not a full-fledged academic institute until the early 90s. There is no room in this presentation to recapitulate the history of this institute, which since the merger with the Masaryk Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences in 26 has operated as the Masaryk Institute and Archives of the Czech Academy of Sciences. Instead, I would focus on several projects on the history of the academies of sciences that have been published in the last decade and brought forth significant results. I should perhaps only clarify that a special department with 7 employees, this is from the beginning of these years. Prior to that, there were only 4 employees, only one of whom had a full-time contract, and even now there are only 2 full-time contracts. It has been assigned to work on the history of the Academy of Sciences in our institute, along with one of the broader team entitled Science and the Scientists in the 19th and 20th century society. Since 29, we have also been publishing a specialized journal entitled Papers on the History of the Academy of Sciences. In Czech, Práce Akademie věd. When working on the history of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences, the researchers always face the question of whether to start directly with research into this institution or whether to focus first on the history of its predecessor, even though that would have meant a project lasting many years, which would require the coordination of several teams of academicians. As an attempt to briefly explain, yet to some extent also in the form of essays, the history of all non-university scientific institutions that existed in the Czech lands from their early modern age beginnings to the 20th century, a book entitled Bohemia Docta on the historical roots of science in the Czech lands, prepared in collaboration with our colleagues from the Institute of Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and dealing with the history of science, was published in Czech in 2011 and in English in 2018. Besides this, my colleague Vlasta Madlova and I prepared a popular book, History of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Pictures, in which we examined the testimonial value of the rich iconographic collections administered by our archives. The book was published in Czech in 2013, and a revised Czech English version was printed 1 year later. As part, we have also established a collaboration with some of the present Institute of the Academy of Sciences in preparing the history, including the predecessor institutions. in 2013, I and my other colleagues published the history of the Institute of Organic Chemistry and Biochemistry of the Czech Academy of Sciences. This institute was quite important for preparing the overall history of the Academy of Sciences, also because in 1953 to 1970, it was headed by František Šorm, who was also the most influential figure in the wall of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences in the 50s and 60s, at first as its general secretary, and later in 1962 to 1969 as its second chairman. In the book, we tried to present not only the Institute's academic activity in the historical context, as well as its routine everyday work and specific atmosphere. We also issued a series of biographical portraits dedicated to important members of the Institute, especially those from the founding era. Another institute was a history was explored by Věra Dvořáčková and other colleagues, was the present Institute of Rock Structure and Mechanics, originally founded from the Institute for Scientific Coal Research and the Mining Institute. Even this genesis clearly indicates that its history was an interesting testimony to the complicated relationships between basic and applied research. It was published in 2018 in Czech, and 1 year later in a revised English version entitled Science Below Rokoska Hill, History of the Institute of Rock Structure and Mechanics. I could continue with this overview of the various topics we are dealing with, but that would leave no time for the presentation of the key project we are now working on, that is the synthetic history of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences, in Czech dějiny Československé Accademia věd. It should perhaps be noted that even though the Masaryk Institute and Archives of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences is the institution where most of the research into the history of the Academies of Sciences is carried out, that certainly does not mean that it is the only institution with this scope of research. In this context, especially the work of our partners in the Institute of Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences should be noted, as they focus on the specialized history of specific scientific disciplines, as well as on topics related, for instance, to academic diplomacy, where publications by Dubravka Olšáková on the Czechoslovak participation in the Backlash movement or in international biological program should be mentioned, and expert cultures during the Cold War, a topic that is being focused on, especially by my colleagues Jiří Hoppe, Vítězslav Sommer, and others. Discussion on the role of the experts and contacts between science and politics appears to be a highly promising research trend, including in the international context. But now I really must move on the project of the history of Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences, now a kind of flagship of our research, and also an important springboard for further research with an international comparative overlap. The basic output of the project of the history of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences should be 4 chronologically organized volumes and an edition of basic documents from the whole period of existence of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. This is from 1952 to 1992. This edition will be printed in paper form too, but the digital version should be the primary form and will allow better use of the source base, including, for example, full text research and so on. The volumes are to be published in Czech, and an abbreviated version in English is expected when the primary volumes are complete, to make the history of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences available for international comparison. So far, only the first volume is available and is dedicated to the first decade of the institution, which was also the era of the first president of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences, the musical theorist and historian, and also communist official, Zdeněk Nedlý. We are now preparing the second volume, which should cover the period up to 1970, the era of the second chairman of the Academy, which was brought to an end by political purges after the occupation of Czechoslovakia and the installation of the new communist leadership that did away with the reforms of the so-called Prague Spring of 1968. The communists declared the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences one of the center of counter-revolution in 1968 and even considered winding it up. Eventually, the Academy was allowed to continue, but larger scale purges and the departure of numerous top scientists for exile hit some of the institutes really hard, and it took them a very long time to recover from that. This will be the scope of the third volume, comprising the history up to 1985, when a new chairman, Josef Říman, was appointed and ushered in an era which is now considered a kind of perestroika in the Academy of Sciences. The fourth volume should cover the period up to 1989 and the subsequent turbulent transformation of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences after the change in the political regime until the end of its existence in 1992. The structure of all parts should be similar. There are chapters explaining the historical context, changes in membership, the organizational history of the institutes, international contact of the academy during the period. Special attention is paid to relations between the Czechoslovak and Slovak academies. Each volume is accompanied by brief series of the key figures of the era. We spent a long time on the question of to what extent we should reflect upon the development of the individual institutes. Eventually, we decided to prepare an overview of development in each of the three major areas of science, which are the technical and mathematical sciences and non-life sciences, the chemical sciences and life sciences, and the social sciences and humanities. Each overview includes an outline of the history of two selected institutes in the relevant era. Wherever possible, we tried to select the key institutes or those that were otherwise important in the context of the relevant period. In the first volume, it was the Institute of Theoretical and Applied Mechanics, Institute of Nuclear Physics, Institute of Biology, Institute of Chemistry, Institute of Ethnography, and Institute of Philosophy. As the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences functioned as the institution in charge of basic research planning, there is a special chapter dealing with this topic. We also focus on the Academy of Sciences as a center of academic life in Czechoslovakia, considering that the Academy operated the most important publishing house for academic literature in the country. This is still the case today. Owned a network of recreational facilities designed for scientists, run a number of disciplinary academic societies, and had an extensive library. Each volume will include annexes giving a complete list of fellows in the relevant period and a list of all the existing institutes. This means, of course, that the first 10 years of institution took up more than 800 pages in a bigger format. So this is not a book you would read while on your travels. However, we are trying to deliver a work which will form a solid base for our subsequent research works in the area of the history of the Academy of Sciences in Czechoslovakia in the latter half of the 20th century. A major part of the texts were produced by the research from our department. Some chapters have been written by the staff of the Institute for Contemporary History, and one chapter was supplied by an employee of the Institute of Philosophy. The chapters describing the relationship between Czechoslovak Academy and the Slovak Academy of Sciences were written by the author of the second part of this contribution that deals with the Slovak part, Adam HUDEK. The following part in his text and describes the history, especially the current state research into the history of the academies and sciences in Czechoslovakia, in Slovakia, sorry. The history of sciences and technologies, including research of scientific institutions, is a very young and short-staffed discipline in Slovakia. In fact, its modest origins are closely connected with the creation of the Slovak Academy of Sciences. During its opening ceremony, its president declared that the Academy would research the history of technical development, industrialization, and scholarship within the territory of Slovakia. For this purpose, three so-called cabinets were created for the history of the biological sciences and medicine, for the history of technical and natural sciences, and for the history of agriculture. In 1959, relocated to the Czechoslovak Academy of Agriculture. They were tiny, each with about 5 employees, the majority of whom had no proper specialization for the job. They were simply natural scientists with an interest in the history of their field. In fact, even today, Slovak universities do not offer courses or topics for graduation thesis dealing with the history of science. And finally, there was no coordination and cooperation in the research plans of this tiny cabinets, which prevented any large-scale projects. However, the research into the history of the Slovak Academy of Sciences resulted in just a handful of articles and 3 books celebrating anniversaries of the Academy. these publications provided basic information and statistical data on the staff, institutes, research activities, international cooperation, etc. At the same time, the individual institutes published books describing their development or the history of their field of research in Slovakia. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Slovak historiography was not affected by the wave of the interest focus on the socialist universities and academies, which was also evident in neighboring countries. Therefore, the decision of the Slovak Academy of Sciences Presidium to create and support a research team to prepare a manuscript on the history of the Slovak Academy was unexpected. In fact, this was the result of the long-term activities of Dusan Kovács, a well-known and influential historian and a former member of the Academy Presidium. He alone put forward the idea that instead of another obligatory celebratory book, the Academy needed a proper scholarly analysis of its development. The team of historians and archivists at the Institute of History and Archive of the Slovak Academy started work in 2010. The manuscript was prepared in 2013 and published in 2014. In the Slovak context, it was an extraordinary project. The book aimed to provide a comprehensive history of Slovak scientific institutions that had played a decisive role in the development of Slovak science. This was done in the context of the political, economic, intellectual, and cultural changes of Slovak and Czechoslovak development. In the process of preparing the book, the excellent structure of the archives of the Slovak Academy became apparent. Between the years 1953 to 1990, the Slovak Academy was an autonomous part of the Czechoslovak Academy. Various of its aspects could not be successfully explained without knowledge of the Czechoslovak sphere. Research in the archives of the Czech Academy of Sciences was thus essential. The works of Czech historians focusing on the Czechoslovak Academy compensated for the lacks of Slovak research on the topic. The work on the history of the Slovak Academy of Sciences brought new impulses for cooperation amongst Czech and Slovak historians dealing with the history of sciences, which materialized in the recent works on the history of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. However, there is a visible difference in numbers. For each Slovak historian researching the topic connected with scientific institutions, the Czechs have a whole research team. That is why this type of cooperation is of such significance for the further development of Slovak historiography. On the other hand, Slovak historians were able to share their experience with their Czech colleagues, such as tested practice and warn against mistakes they made. In general, the fact that the history of the Slovak Academy of Sciences has been already written proves to be beneficial for the work on the far more complicated and more extensive project of the history of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. In conclusion, we can say that the publication of the history of Slovak Academy sadly did not result in growing interest in the history of science in Slovakia. The research team preparing the book ceased to exist right after it was published. However, the publication represents the first comprehensive history of a socialist academy in Central Europe. parts of the text were also published in English and German. The existence of this book represents solid basis for other, perhaps more sophisticated research projects. For example, Czechoslovak educational aid programs in sub-Saharan Africa, researched by a young PhD student at the Institute of History. This is a part from Adam HUDEK. I could end my contribution in a similar manner. For us, to the history of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences should become the anticipated basis for further projects with a more specific scope and more sophisticated methodology. Our team, too, sees great potential in research into the Czechoslovak scientific assistance into the so-called third world countries. We also to continue our research into the scientists and science status in Czech society in the 20th century project, and in biographical and prosopographical research, which is still somewhat overlooked here in comparison with the countries of Western Europe. We also focus on the symbolical aspects of science affecting the life of society, whether in symbols of progress, such as the use of concrete in the building industry, and the topic of the atomic nucleus, or the slogans of nutritional rationalization and improvement. Wherever possible, we want to make the greatest possible use of the comparative international research framework. And in this respect, we set our hopes on collaboration within the European History of Academies Research Initiative. Our colleagues from the Institute of Contemporary History, in turn, have been quite active in international projects on the topics of academic diplomacy, especially during the Cold War. The greatest problem that remains here is that our work is highly dependent on the projects gained. There is still a lack of institutional funds, and given the current economic situation, this are in fact expected to decline further. And this
Martin, excuse me, Martin, you have used up your time and a little more, so I will have to ask you to finish now.
Yes, this is a common problem in Czech Republic, just as it in Slovakia. Thank you for your attention. Sorry.